Hello everyone, good day. This is the supplemental lecture video for the second module of our sociology class, and we will focus on sociological research and sociological theories. So in terms of doing research in sociology, you have learned that there are three perspectives in doing sociological research. We have positivism, we have interpretivism, and we have critical research perspective. So let's go first with positivism. So of course, you've learned that Auguste Comte, the founder of sociology, is also the founder of positivist philosophy. And the argument here is that we learn about truth, about the things that are observable, things that are measurable, and therefore objectivity is one of the most important things that a researcher must seek for in terms of describing and explaining the social phenomena that is around him. Auguste Comte had to put forward this philosophy because during this time, when he was trying to argue that sociology is a legitimate science, most of the sciences that were emerging in the scientific revolution era were natural sciences like biology, physics, chemistry. And during that time, there were a lot of reservations from other scholars, and they were wondering whether society could really be understood or could be studied as a formal science, where in fact, society, social behaviors, psychological behaviors during this time were so hard to observe, were so hard to grasp. It's not like the experiments that you could do in a specific laboratory wherein when you put reagent A to reagent B and then the colors will change. It's so hard to do the same kind of thinking during that time. It was so hard for them to imagine that studies in social sciences could be equated to that type of science, of the natural sciences. And so, Auguste Comte came up with a philosophy of positivism in order to argue what really should be the parameters of how we are able to get to the truth, even the social truth. And therefore, he said that as long as the researcher, as long as the scientist is able to base his inferences based on his observation, based on quantitative data, based on statistical results, then maybe these things could be described as true in reality. And as I've said very in passing, in explaining positivism, yes, most of the positivist research done in sociological research is quantitative in nature. Because again, positivism is about, in order for it to become something that is understandable in reality, it has to be observable, it has to be measurable. So as we measure in medicine the number of antibodies in order for a certain person to have COVID-19 in the blood, we also have certain parameters in the social sciences whether a certain person is happy. There can be statistical parameters for that, or whether a certain family has a good relationship. We can already quantify that. Whether a certain country has a peaceful environment or a peaceful culture, we can also be able to measure that. Or if a certain leader is trying to practice a certain leadership style, you can also make a measurement out of that. So, yeah, according to Auguste Comte, both in the social and in the natural reality, we can make use of quantitative data to describe and analyze and explain phenomenon. So to give an example, this is a research that I did way back in 2014, but I published this recently last year. And basically, what I was trying to explain in this study is that the extent to which students are socially involved in their school can predict the extent of their mental health. So as I said in positivism, there should be measures and observable standards in relation to the social variables that we are studying. In this case, student involvement was what I tried to measure. And how did I measure this in this study? I measured it through involvement in clubs, their self-perceived, their self-rated frequency of engagement with different school entities like their teachers, like their peers, etc., etc. So those were my measurements for student engagement, and I also had an instrument to be able to measure mental health by letting the students answer that, and the same thing for quality of life. And I made use of statistics in order to correlate these things together, and I did find out that more specifically in engagement to student organization, the more students are engaged in student organization, the more likely that they have better mental health outcomes. Now, the next perspective in terms of doing sociological research is interpretivism. And interpretivism was very much supported by and argued by and asserted by Max Weber. And he used the term Versitehen. And Versitehen basically means subjectivity. So while positivists say that we can only say that a certain thing is true, or we can only describe something based on observable characteristics and observable measure, Max Weber argues, and the interpretivist perspective of sociological research argues, that there's also a importance in terms of looking at the subjective experiences of people in order to understand reality, and making use of lived experience in order to explain social reality. And most of the research that are done in an interpretivist framework are qualitative research. Now, you've learned this probably earlier in your research methods class or in your SHS classes, but qualitative research is basically research wherein most of the data collection methods are like interviews, focus group discussions, etc., etc. So instead of having a standard or an external measure to be able to gauge a certain social reality, just like social integration or involvement in social groups, we measure social reality in interpretivism through the lived experiences of people who have been engaged in the given social context or social reality. And there's some sort of love-hate relationship between an interpretivist scholar and a positivist scholar, because positivist scholars would always ask you, it's so difficult to verify the truth behind a story or an experience, and it's so hard to make things objective in that case. And of course, interpretivists would say, but it's so hard to flesh out feelings and emotions and insights from just numbers alone. So these are some of the differing ideas between positivists and interpretivists in terms of doing research in the social sciences. So this now is an example of a research that I was able to publish and present in a research conference abroad. And basically, the goal of this study is to be able to look into how music artists who are found in an online community of Facebook understand the role of social capital in terms of them being able to experience their musical talents and be able to connect with other people in relation to having more experience in relation to music and the arts. Social capital basically means, in layman's terms, that the strength of your social networks that basically also influences the outcomes that you can have. And social capital is very important, especially in the Philippines, because this is basically one of the reasons why we survive despite having historically a not so perfect government compared to more developed countries. The reason why we survive earthquakes and floods is because we have a big string of social networks that we can depend upon in cases of our needs. And the argument of this study is that in an online community, music artists can also gain that social capital. So for example, because of being a member of that social community or online community on Facebook, other music artists in that community are able to gain more knowledge about music. They get to have access to the resources of other musicians who they become friends with it in that group. They're also able to access opportunities in terms of performing and being able to get gigs in different events in the metro. So that is basic. And I did this research by basically interviewing some of the members of the group, and I also did this by analyzing the narratives that they were giving out in the Facebook group that they were part of. So this is an example of an interpretivist study. And finally, the third sociological research, a more recent one, probably around in the 90s, no, in the 1980s, 90s, is the critical sociological research perspective. And basically, the argument here is not the goal of research is not only about trying to explain reality, but basically, we argue that research should have a purpose, research should be value driven, research should be able to uplift the conditions of the marginalized sectors of society. So it's value driven, it works towards social change. So an example of a research in relation to critical perspectives are those research that take on a feminist tone, wherein they try to see how the experiences of women every day reflect the unequal nature of power between men and women in society. So these are examples of critical research. And also, critical research can also be participatory and transformative in nature, in meaning that the research problem or the research objective is not only solely set by the researcher but also collaborated with the people that the researcher wants to help. So for example, in a community-based research, instead of the research saying that this is what we will find out because this is what I think you need, the researcher does not enter with a research project already in mind. The researcher immerses himself in the community, and then through experiencing life in the community, he collaborates with the community, and they all put their heads together in order to be able to come up with a research project that will translate to better outcomes for that community. So this is an example of a critical research. It's not mine, obviously, but this study basically looks into documented research studies on gender and looks at the amount of research that has been done in order to brand, in terms of branding women as sluts, and looking at masculinity as a celebrated trait. So this is an example of a critical research perspective. And then also, we were able to learn about the different sociological research methods that we can do when we do sociological research. So one, you can do social experiment. Like for example, if you remember in the early 2019, when they were having a democratic debate in the United States, one of the forerunners were Andrew Yang, and Andrew Yang said that one of his platforms would be universal basic income, meaning as you reach age 18, you will receive $1,000 from the government every month from age 18. And of course, people didn't like that. Like free income every month, no strings attached. So anyway, but there was a social experiment done wherein they were able to expose a certain community to a universal basic income setup wherein they receive certain amounts of money in a regular period of time, and they compared it with a similar community but did not receive universal basic income, and they were able to find out that the outcomes for the university basic income community were better compared to those of the UBI, and they were also able to find out that those who practiced UBI did not produce members who were slacking off or lazy. They were actually more productive compared to the non-UBI community. So that's an example of an experiment wherein the independent variable, in this case, the exposure to the universal basic income policy, is going to be applied to a group of people and will be compared to another group of people who will not receive the intervention, and to see whether or not that certain intervention or policy is effective. So after experiments, the most common social research method are surveys. And surveys basically is a self-report data collection tool wherein it is the participant who gives you the information that you need. It can either be through a telephone survey, although it's not very common in the Philippines. And more common ones are the written, wherein you provide a questionnaire to the participant wherein all the items referring to the variables that you want to measure are found, and then you will ask that person to answer truthfully. And then we also have online forms of survey, like you have your Google Forms, and you can also make use of that in collecting data for sociological research. Surveys are also what we use for our censuses. Censuses, like when we're trying to determine the population and demographics of a certain place or locality, is also accomplished using a survey. And we also have what we call ethnographies through participant observation. When we say participant observation, the researcher is participating or immersed in the phenomenon that he or she wants to study. So for example, you want to study about the culture of a certain indigenous people. Usually, you immerse yourself in their community for a long period of time so that you get to feel how it is to be a human in their locality or in their community. And basically, ethnography means, ethno means culture and graphy means to write. Sorry, ethno means tribe. So to write about a tribe or to write about culture. And also, for sociological research, you don't always have to collect new data. There may already be previous data that has been collected before, like big data, accumulated data. Like for example, social media data is already available at your fingertips. Or for example, health records. Or for example, in MMDA, you have a number of records for apprehensions and types of accidents or types of traffic violations. So these charts, these data sets can already be used in order for you to make certain analysis. So that we call that sociological research method as review of records. Now, as a social researcher, we deal with human lives, and therefore research ethics is very important. And one of the most important research ethic consideration is informed consent. When you say informed consent, prior to collecting a data from a certain person, we have to get voluntary informed consent from the people that we want to engage in our research. So first, we inform the person and comprehensively about our study, what are the benefits and risks of being a part of the study, what are the potential outcomes and benefits and incentives that a certain person can get as a part of that research. And then we give the person the liberty or the freedom to say yes or no to the study. So that's informed consent, just like your consent before any type of intimate relationship, diba? And more importantly also is the treating your data with utmost confidentiality. Especially if you're doing research about very sensitive stuff, like for example, prostitution or commercial sex work or child labor, child abuse, or HIV or drug addiction. The identities of your research participants should not be connected to the data that you're collecting. So you have to anonymize your data set so that it will not be able to be connected with the identity of your participants. That can cause them legal repercussions or embarrassment. And also, privacy. When you keep your data, you should be able to keep them in a place wherein those who are unauthorized to access it won't be able to access it. So unauthorized mean if they're not part of the research team, if they're not analyzing the data, they shouldn't have hold of the research data. And this is something that you will also do and learn when you do your own thesis in the future. So now let's go to the important early theorists in sociology. So first we have Emile Durkheim. No, Emile Durkheim basically was the one who first put ideas in structural functionalism, one of the basic paradigms in sociology. Now, Emile Durkheim argues that society is an organism with different parts, and each part is interdependent with each other. So you can just imagine that a society is a human body, and each social institution like religion, government, education, family, economic system are the body organs, and we are the cells that work together under a given institution, and we interact with other institutions, and then we work together. All these body organs work together in order to, perform as a fully functioning organism. And of course, social dysfunction happens when, for example, in the human body, when a certain body part is damaged, then the whole body can feel it, right? Sabi nga nila, ang sakit sa kalingkingan, dama ng buong katawan. And that's the same thing with society. If one aspect of society is not functioning well, then the whole society will feel that dysfunction. Like for example, in our case in the COVID-19 pandemic, recently as I'm making this video, the franchise denial for ABS-CBN has been recently approved, and we can feel that even that ABS-CBN is one minute sector of society, we can definitely feel as a society what the impacts. Like for example, of course, we know that some people from far-flung areas may not have access to the information, and then of course some economics ecosystems may be broken. Like for example, advertising agencies might have lesser projects to get because advertisements is very much dependent on broadcast networks. Of course, some catering companies may also lose some connections or networks because again, in shootings, diba, there are a lot of caterings, etc., etc. So, yung sakit na yon, that specific problem that the removal of ABS-CBN has caused is felt by the whole society. According to Emile Durkheim also, the society works as an organism because we have what we call social solidarity. Now, based on the type of society that we have, defines the type of solidarity that it has. Now, the first type is your organic solidarity, and then we also have your mechanical solidarity. So when we say mechanical solidarity, this is the type of solidarity wherein all the people in that community is doing the same thing. And usually, mechanical solidarity happens in societies that are hunter-gatherer or yung mga more primitive type of societies, no? For example, in these societies, because there's no technology, everyone hunts, everyone gathers food, everyone knows how to start a fire. So, because everyone is preoccupied with personal survival, they are not able to do other things but, do these things in relation to survival. So, that's an example of mechanical solidarity. Everyone is doing the same thing. Now, in more advanced society, we can see what we call an organic solidarity. When we say organic solidarity, not everyone is doing the same thing because people in a society become more specialized based on their strengths and training. In a primitive society, if you're hungry, you go hunt a deer, you cook the deer, and you eat the deer. But in a more advanced society, when you're hungry, you can go downstairs, buy an egg, and go cook that egg and then eat the egg. But you don't have to be the one to raise the chicken because you can already purchase the chicken by someone who's specializing in raising in chicken. So because you don't have to raise domesticate animals or you don't have to plant your own trees because you already are dependent to some other person or some other institution who does creation of poultry or whatever, you can already do the things that you're specialized at. Like for example, teaching or being whatever professional you are. So that's example of organic solidarity. You do the things that you specialize on and you are dependent on the specialization of other people in society. And that knowledge that everyone is interdependent with each other and that keeps us a well-oiled rig of a society, then that is organic solidarity. And then of course, we have discussed about social facts. These are facts that are that influence our behavior that are external to us. And also, Emile Durkheim introduced the concept of common consciousness wherein there's already a common sense that is shared by everyone in terms of the things that we have to do and the way that we should behave in a given community. And we'll talk about this more when we discuss about culture. And according to Emile Durkheim, a good society is socially integrated, meaning the people in the society know that they belong to that society and has an allegiance and conformity in the group. And according to Emile Durkheim, when society has collective consciousness and they all feel that they belong in that community and they have common ideals about the community, they behave the same way, they believe the same things, they are interdependent, they have their own specialties, and they are helping each other based on their roles and functions in society, then society will not reach a dysfunction. It will always maintain an equilibrium. So, if there is a problem in terms of social integration, like for example, you don't feel like you belong in the society that you belong in, which probably some of you feel in the current situation that we have now, then that is a sign of social dysfunction. So, we cannot say that at the moment the Philippines is in a very functional mode of society. We feel that there are a lot of frictions within our society because of a lot of divisive ideas, of course. And, according to Emile Durkheim, that is one of the things that can lead us to have dysfunction. And Emile Durkheim also argued that even the most personal behavior, such as suicide, is influenced by society. And then before I proceed, trigger warning. And Emile Durkheim also argued that even the most personal behaviors such as suicide is also influenced by societal forces. Now, according to Durkheim, there are 4 types of suicide, and these 4 types of suicides can be described according to the social reality that revolves around the person. And according to Durkheim, there are 2 variables that influences this. One, we have social regulation, the extent to which society is able to impose its social facts on the individual's behavior. And integration is basically the feeling of belongingness of a certain person to the society where he belongs to. So the first type is egoistic suicide. Egoistic suicide is when there's low social regulation and low integration. So these are the people who feel that they don't have control over their lives and they are disconnected with other people in society. And this is basically the common types of suicide that we see. That they have lost their hopes in lives and they don't have a social support. Another type of suicide is altruistic suicide, wherein there's high regulation, meaning society compels them more, and then we have high integration, wherein they feel that they belong to a society and they have close ties to it. So, an example of altruistic suicide are the kamikaze bombers in Japan. Like, they are willing to commit suicide for the good of the country. So because they are highly regulated by their country and they have pride of being a nationalist in their country, so they're willing to risk their life for their country. So like example are the kamikaze bombers in Japan. Next, we have anomic suicide, wherein there's low regulation but high integration. So this usually happens to people who are socially integrated but are facing really high stress in their lives. So for example, if you remember the news about a farmer who committed suicide because he thought that he has COVID-19, and because he loved his family so much, he didn't want to transmit the virus to his family. That's why he committed suicide. So he had high integration with his community, with his family, but he had low regulation because of his situation of being what he thought that he was a COVID-19 patient. And we have fatalistic suicides, wherein they belong to a society wherein there's so much regulation, but they don't really feel that they belong to it. So an example would be being, for example, in North Korea, wherein their movements are so restricted, but they don't really feel a sense of belongingness in their country. So the suicide rates there are also high. Now we go to Karl Marx. Again, Karl Marx is the main proponent or the earliest proponent of conflict theory, and basically his argument is that society is all about where the centers of power are located, and it's always something that will always exhibit some sort of inequality. And of course, Karl Marx has suggested that this inequality is in terms of social classes, and then eventually other conflict theorists would point out to other categorizations of inequality such as gender, race, and ethnicity. And then, of course, Karl Marx was also the proponent of historical materialism. Basically, the amount of resources that is amassed, the surplus of supplies and goods has influenced the way people relate to these goods, and therefore those who hold the means of production are more powerful in society, and those who do labor are those who are found in the more marginalized state in society. According to Karl Marx, there are what we call superstructures in society that maintains that equality. What are examples of superstructures? Basically, these are the social institutions in society. Like, for example, how does education maintain inequality? So we have private schools and public schools, and most of the time private schools provide better education compared to public schools, so the outcomes of students in private schools are better. They get to amass more fortune because their future is more clearer compared to public schools. And public schools, because they get lesser forms of education, they have lesser outcomes, lesser opportunities in life, and therefore nagre-reproduce yung kanilang marginalization within their sector compared to those who are exposed to the private school. For example, in religion, there are traditions wherein ang mga nakaupo sa harapan ng Catholic ng church ay mga nasa harapan, and then hindi ka papapasukin sa loob ng simbahan if you are wearing not so clean clothes. So that's an example of how the social institutions can proliferate the ongoing inequality in our country or in society. And of course, we've learned about the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are the ones who own the means of the production and who gets most of the goods and surplus. And of course, we have the proletariat, the workers, the exploited, the laborers, and those who will eventually rise up against the bourgeoisie if they get fed up with the very bad conditions that they're exposed to. And of course, we've talked about the modes of production, that basically in the time of Marx, the modes of production are the factories. And as we go to the contemporary era where we are now, the modes of productions are more than manufacturing or factories. Now, our modes of production are those who own the information economy. So, sino yung mga modes of production heads natin dito? Si Zuckerberg. No? So sila yung mga kinoconsider natin most of production. He who holds much of the workings in the internet now, those who hold so much of the power of information, the ones who can wield information and truth, now that's the mode of production in our current society. And of course, Karl Marx also argued class struggles, as a way to be able to realize, if you're a proletariat, that you are being oppressed and you are in a crisis situation, and because there's a crisis and you want to rise above that very bad condition that you are in society, you spark a revolution. And basically that's historical materialism. History will basically lead society to go to a thesis, to an antithesis, meaning something that to beat the current system. And probably we'll see a lot of that in most areas in the world right now because of the rise of authoritarian leaders. Also, another philosopher called Gramsci, he coined the term hegemony. And hegemony argues that these are overarching ideas that are held to be true and held to be dominant. And these are the causes of oppression in our society. For example, one of the hegemonic ideas that we believe are West is best. And therefore, it's easy for Eastern people, Asian people, to bow down in terms of Western ideas and Western products and always think of them as the best. And these types of ideas that are hegemonic, they cause more oppression to to businesses in Asia, no, it's hard for them to flourish because there's always the thinking na West is best. Or an example of hegemonic idea is heteronormativity. Meaning of heteronormativity is the only acceptable type of sexual desire is heterosexual sexual desires. So if you fall in love or have sexual desires for the same sex, then you are considered to be a marginalized sector of society, or marginalized or minoritized. And of course, we still experience that for the LGBTQ community, who are still not provided with equal rights with their heterosexual and cis counterparts. And of course, another theorist that was explained, no, and one of the important theories of sociology is Max Weber. And Max Weber basically described modern society as being calculable, meaning we are so we have become obsessed with numbers and measurements in our society nowadays. And there's methodical behavior, meaning we follow sets of rules and guidelines in our everyday living. We are governed by laws that are formal. We are governed by policies, etc. And then reflexivity, meaning we can judge the way we do things, no, and we try to rationalize the way we do things. So that is basically what modern society is, no. And also, Max Weber says that in modern society, there is what we call bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is basically what we see in formal organizations right now. Pag sinabi natin mabureaucrasya, ibig sabihin there is a lot of levels in the organizations that we have right now, diba? The approval in an organization has to go through many levels of approvals, diba? Another would be the relations of people in a bureaucracy is very impersonal. Work first before personal relationship. So that's what Max Weber said about our society. Most of our formal organizations are bureaucratic. And it comes to a point wherein society, or the people in society, becomes very tired of bureaucracy, and they feel like they are put in an iron cage wherein most of their behaviors are restrained because we have to be very formal. We have to move a certain way in an organization because bureaucracy tells us that these are the guidelines, etc., etc. So modern society is like that. We can feel constrained. We feel like our behaviors are constrained because of the many formal and informal norms that are around us. And picking up from the work of Karl Marx, Max Weber also argued that there are a lot of power struggles that are happening in society, in modern society. He argues that our societies are basically socially categorized: rich, poor, male, female, straight, LGBTQ, DDS, Dilawan, shucks. And then this categorization, there's always one category who always has less power, and these categories that have less power also have access to less resources and opportunities in society. Like for example, when you compare Caucasians with people of color in the United States, diba? People of color have access to lesser opportunities in their country. Or for instance, if you are a female, you have lesser opportunities compared to a male in a patriarchal society that we have now, and etc., etc. So that is what power struggle is about. Power struggles is influenced by our membership to certain social categories. Now let's go to the history of sociology in the Philippines, and some of the important thinkers of sociology in the Philippines. So, sociology was introduced in the University of Santo Tomas in 1896 and UP in 1919. And the first teacher of sociology in UST was Father Valentin Marin OP. And the first Filipino who gained a doctoral degree in sociology in University of Wisconsin is Serafin Macaraig, and of course he was the one who started to flourish the discipline of sociology in the Philippines. And one of the more famous and relevant educational institutions in sociology is the Ateneo de Manila University. And they instituted the Institute of Philippine Culture, where a lot of sociological studies are being done, and this has been established by Father Frank Lynch. And in the Philippines, we have the Asian Social Institute. Yan. And then, one of the more celebrated sociologists in the Philippines is Professor Randy David. And he is a professor emeritus at UP who has an AB Sociology. And the reason why he's famous is because he's a newscaster at ABS-CBN. And when he does his reporting, he also gives some sort of sociological analysis on the reports that he makes about the society. I'll try to put as a YouTube video of his report so that you can know who Randy David is if you don't know him yet. Ayan. So, in this video, we were able to discuss about the different sociological research perspectives and methods. And then we were able to discuss in detail some of the arguments of the early sociological theorists such as Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx, and Max Weber. And we were also acquainted with some of the who's who and the history of sociology in the Philippines.